Thank you very much. Look, it's really wonderful to be here. Oh, man, that's a big picture, hey? Libby will tell you I was quite resistant to actually speaking here. And the reason for that was an economist is very focused on certain parts of society. And what you're talking about here is something much wider. But Libby convinced me because I think there are perspectives that we need to consider. And economics has come to dominate a lot of our public conversations, a lot of our policy making, and certainly a lot of our politics is dominated by, I think, quite faulty economics out there. So I want to give you a little bit of a perspective of my view of the world as an economist and hopefully trying to relate it to the theme of the day today and tomorrow. Some of the big themes I really want to talk about is I want to take a New Zealand perspective, and quite often, the conversations when it comes to New Zealand's economy and society starts in the 1980s, as if we don't have history, as if we don't have indigenous people, as if we don't have cultures and ways of thinking that are different. I want to touch a little bit on where the future of New Zealand is going, because the world does look different. And it might feel very scary at times, but also I think we should be very confident that it's possible to be optimistic if we take control. It's very easy to kind of just give up and say everything is out of my control and nothing's going to change. That's not how it works. We all have a role to play, as citizens, as people of influence, as people of expertise, whatever that might be. I truly believe that we're in the middle of regime change, that the world as we know it is changing. The way we think about things is changing. And that means two things. One, for us to be knowledgeable about the change that's taking place, what didn't work in the past, but then looking forward and saying, what part will I play in that new world that's coming? And this is a really exciting time. It can feel very dispiriting, but it can be exciting because it is the interregnum. Interregnum means to be in between, a place of in between. We get to shape what happens next. And we either shape the future or the future shapes us. I don't want us to be in the latter category. I think we've let too much of that happen to us over the course of the last 20 years, where the world has happened to us and we've kind of gone along for the ride. That's not good enough. That is not the role of citizens. That is not the role of individuals. We've got to take more control. There are lots of difficult choices in front of us, but they're not inevitable, right? We can make choices. And fundamentally, what you started with yesterday, I wasn't here, but I heard about it, that what you talked about is values. And fundamentally, everything comes down to values because it's about the objectives of what we're going to do. And the theme of today is about global citizenship, and personally, I identify as a humanist and humanism because fundamentally that's the basis of globalism. That's the foundation of global citizenship, but it's the fundamental of being a good person. You have to care about other people. And if you start from the position of care, it makes it so much easier. Now, as an economist, I get to work on lots of different things. And one of the really exciting, difficult, but rewarding projects I've ever worked on was on a project between the Crown and Tūhoe. Now, those of you who know Tūhoe, they are a fierce people, and I love it. They pretty much said, fuck off, we're not going to do it that way. You don't come here and tell us what to do, because our values are not translated in the way that you do things. You are repressing us. You are creating poverty that is perpetuated through the actions that you take. Your welfare systems keep us in poverty, on the edges of hunger, but make no improvement. That's not good enough. And they said, if we want to work together, we have to find a way to translate our worldviews and find out where they're different and how we can do things differently. And so I spent a few weeks working on this project, and like I said, it was a really bizarre experience for an economist, right? Because that's not the kind of thing you'd normally do as an economist. But it was a really exciting project because essentially what we did was we went, if we take Tūhoe's tikanga and we try and translate that to how we think about the economy, how we think about the world, our objectives, our ways of doing things, what does it tell us? And do you know what we found? We found that at its core, we have the same principles, but how we choose to play them out are different. Our pictures of success, our pictures of what we want to be, how we would know if we're successful, are in fact different. Now, my report had lots of tables and numbers and things like that, which are, quite frankly, not very interesting for most people. But I had one amazing graphic artist who was in my presentations, and so she translated that worldview into the picture that you see behind me. On the left-hand side is essentially the orthodox view of what success looks like. And on the right-hand side is what Tūhoe's worldview looks like in terms of success. And the reason I show you that picture is it's about perspective. in each of us, our idea of success, our idea of what good looks like can be very different, and that's okay. We need to understand why is it that we're coming from these different places, and that there must be different ways of dealing with those differences and those perspectives. Libby mentioned perspectives before in terms of why global citizenship doesn't mean that we change perspectives. It means we need to find out how we work with each other, and where there are gaps, we find ways to bridge those gaps. Now, I can tell you, with the experience of working with Tuhoe, those bridging of those gaps is difficult, because sometimes our worldviews are not parallel, and you can't just bring them together. Sometimes they're perpendicular. They're looking at different ways. I'll give you a couple of examples of how Tuhoe's view differs so much from the way that we think about things. When we do a business case, quite often we'll say, well, you can do a bit of pollution there, but if you make enough money and give something back over there, that's okay. Because in a cost-benefit analysis, those two benefits and costs cancel out. And Tuhoe say, no, you can't do that. You can't pollute and defile nature on this side and say somehow that because you've got jobs over there, that it's worthwhile. That somehow these two things are fungible, when our very idea of nature, of Mother Earth, is imbued with spirituality. You cannot possibly defile one and do the other. So the whole idea of fungibility, the way that we reduce everything to this common denominator of dollars, doesn't work in these different worldviews. The other key distinction is perspective of time. So much of everything that we do in government is about what are the costs and benefits to me today. And yet, pretty much all of Tikanga and all of Te Aomari, and in fact, most indigenous economies and societies is, what would I do if I was standing 100 years out looking back to today? That perspective on this side of the telescope or that side of the telescope entirely shifts the balance of what you would choose to do, particularly on things like education, welfare, environmental change. All those things give you a much greater ability to invest in things that might bear short-term cost and inconvenience, but allows you to make those investments. And you can see today the very cynical general election that's taking place around you right now. Climate change, yeah, it's a bit of a nice to have, isn't it? Well, it's not a nice to have. The world is burning, the world is drowning, the world will starve if we don't change. And yet our politicians act as if we have time. Bunch of dickheads, right? Technical term. I want to give you a little bit of a sense of why, even from an economic perspective, thinking about the world is so critical for us. It's critical because New Zealand exists not only from that social perspective of us being citizens of the planet, which comes with a lot of responsibilities, not with rights, right? The rights are very national, but the responsibilities are very global. I wanted to talk a little bit about the nation state and look out and look at how New Zealand engages in this world. And really the big story comes from us being very engaged in the global economy, in global society. We trade with each other, right? Quite often when we think about things like economics and trade, we think that nations are trading with each other. Nations don't do nothing. Businesses and people trade with each other. That's where the relationships are. So even our language of economics takes away that face of humanity, those personalities of individuals making decisions, that everything is within control. But I want to show you this chart on the left-hand side, which shows you our exports and imports as a share of GDP. And you can see just even back in the 1800s, New Zealand was so much of our economy, so much of our jobs, so much of our activity that was going on the lands was about dealing with the rest of the world. So about a third of our economy is exports and a third of the economy is in imports. And you can see there's a huge amount of this global connection, particularly in the last 30 years. That increase in globalization, New Zealand has absolutely ridden that wave. And we're a big part of the world. We rely on the world for a lot of the things that we like, and the world relies on us for a lot of the things that it wants. And whether it's in things like meat, dairy, forestry, whatever, we also want to be able to drive cars and have nice things in our houses. If it wasn't for imports, we wouldn't be able to have any of those things, right? Because we don't make those things in New Zealand. But I want you to look at these charts and get that sense of history that, one, we've been engaged with the world for a very long time, and two, that has increased significantly over the course of the last 30 years. what we do and how we engage with the world has changed a lot over the course of the last 100 years. On the left-hand side, you can see, our sort of composition of exports in the 1800s was very much about gold and forestry, right? Because we were very good at those kinds of things. And then you fast forward to today, and you can see we've become much more diverse. The kinds of things that we export to the world has shifted. We're still far too dependent on things like meat, dairy, and forestry because we're actually good at those things, right? In some ways. In other ways, you look at what's been happening in places like Gisborne, you kind of go, well, maybe we're not so good at growing forests in Gisborne, where the hills are actually really slippery and really good, poor quality, and we shouldn't be building exotic forests there, which we have known for 20 years, but we choose to do anyway because we don't care about externalities, right? Again, it's that kind of dickhead policies, right? It's where we know that there is a cost. We know there is a problem, but we choose to prioritize those short-term benefits because it benefits certain groups of people. It's really frustrating when you see that just because you see the evidence there doesn't mean it's enough to change the power balance. It's not enough if we as citizens and as voters demand change. On the right-hand side, you can just see how those shares change a lot over time. Going back to the 1800s, you can see the gold rush is so visible, right? When we had something like 60% of our exports at its peak, that was gold, and now gold is really tiny. In fact, the gold mines in New Zealand is one of my clients, and I work with them quite regularly. Phenomenal business, right? But it's tiny relative to what it was in history. Whereas in places like Otago, it was one of the major employers in that region, it now only employs a few hundred people. And it's still important from an export perspective, but from a social importance, economic importance, its local importance, that has changed a lot. I'd also like you to sort of identify and understand that the way that we engage with the world changes a lot over time as well. So the people that we export with, the trade with, that changes significantly. So on the left-hand side, you can see that, going back 100 years, most of our trade was with the UK, right? That was the umbilical cord back to the colonial mother. And that sort of lasted for a while until the UK said, bye-bye, we're joining the EU. Don't care about you anymore. And those relationships can shift very, very quickly. And you can see on the right-hand side chart just how quickly those shifts can happen. Look at that gray line. We had, 90%, 80% of our exports going to the UK for a number of decades. That was our entry into the world and to Europe. And all of a sudden, that changed overnight. And we had to scramble really, really hard to find those changes. But we did. And to think that the way that the world is today will be the way the world will be tomorrow is wrong. Our own history shows us that these things can change really rapidly, and we're entirely capable of making those changes. There's huge amounts of flexibility and ability for us to flex and change with the world as it happens. And in the idea of change, quite often these are either relentless, gradual processes. I was having a real argument with the police commissioner yesterday. He wanted to use the word evolve for this really terrible thing that's been happening in terms of our organized crime in New Zealand. I said, you can't say evolve. It's not evolving. It's a crisis, right? It's changed really quickly. Evolve is something that's happening gradually but inevitably. And that's, I think, what you can see on the left-hand side. You can see that decline of manufacturing in New Zealand, or the primary sector in New Zealand. That's evolving, right? It's gradual, persistent, it's sustained. These things are probably going to be very hard for us to turn around. So you can see the green line, the share of primary sector as a share of our economy. Back in the 100 years ago was a third of our jobs. Today it's less than 7%, right? That is an evolving nature of this death by 1,000 cuts. The rest of the economy is growing, the agriculture sector is not. It's not a bad thing. It just means we're finding different ways of doing things. But there are also things that can happen all of a sudden. The UK joining the EU, or the fact that we all of a sudden work from home, right? The reason we have so many people joining the conference online is partly because over the course of the COVID years, we've really learned how to engage online, how to do things differently, sometimes well, sometimes not. But look at the chart on the right-hand side. Pretty much until COVID, only about 1 in 10 people used to work from home some of the time. After COVID, it's a third of people. A third. There's a tripling. That kind of change is wrenching. It can be really disruptive. And we see the effects of it in places like the CBD, on the fringe of Auckland CBD, where I was talking to a property developer the other day, and they're saying, it's going to be so easy to buy up all these empty buildings because nobody wants them. and we're going to convert them to residential apartments, which is going to be nice, because we could do with a few more in Auckland. But these changes are quite interesting, right? These are interesting because there are these kind of slow-moving forces at the back, but quite often something will come along, and it'll be super disruptive. Something will shift really suddenly, and we've got to be prepared for both to be able to engage and plan for those gradual, predictable changes, but have the facility and the ability for us to be able to respond to those really substantive changes, rapid changes, when they suddenly turn up. I'm going to give you a little bit of a perspective around dairy, because dairy is quite a dominant narrative in New Zealand, because we think that somehow it's the backbone of the country. There's no one industry in New Zealand that's the backbone. I get really frustrated when people say that. You know, there are more people working in finance sector in Auckland than there are people working in the dairy sector. You know, bugger off telling us that that's the backbone of the country. You know, it's like, so what? That other parts of the economy don't matter? Those other jobs are not worth something? Of course they are. We're in it together. We all fill a role to play. But I want to tell you the dairy story, because quite often we lose perspective of why we do these things. Why do we have economic activity? Why do we want to trade? Why do we want to export? Why do we want to have good relationships with other countries? And through the dairy story, at least, hopefully I can tell you some of these kinds of things. So dairy takes a very dominant narrative in New Zealand because it's such a big export, right? So as a share of our exports, it's currently around 1/3 of all the things that we sell to the world. But in terms of our share of our economy, it's less than 10%. So yes, it's big in terms of our exports and our relationship with the world. But when it comes to the amount of economic activity across all of New Zealand, or the number of jobs, it's actually relatively small. We also tell ourselves that we are very big, and we are quite big. And on the right-hand side, you can see that we're about 10% of global dairy exports. But 10% of global dairy exports is big for a country of our size, but it's not the dominant player. We have to understand that New Zealand is a margin of error on everything. We're at the arse end of nowhere, and we are a tiny, tiny, tiny population and a tiny economy. But we actually punch above our weight when it comes to our influence on the global economy, on things like dairy, or when it comes to things like our role in the UN, or in the WTO, or in what you might have seen with the Christchurch call, that we can still show leadership. We can still have a dominant or an important role to play in lots of different places. So yes, sometimes we kind of get too caught up in the domestic, and sometimes we diminish ourselves too much in the global field. Both of those things can be true. It's really about how do we use our position, and why is it that the world chooses to listen to us? I don't know if Minister Mahuta mentioned to you the reason why New Zealand runs such a, I guess, a balanced diplomatic position. And the reason for that is it allows us entry into every room. We have a voice in many places. When you've become super aligned to one power or another, it makes it very difficult for you to be able to have that position. Now, the reason why I want to talk to you about dairy is because quite often I think people misunderstand why we do certain things and why some of these things come to be, why New Zealand chooses to dedicate its resources and its activities in particular ways. And one of the big myths is that we do it because dairy prices are really high. It's not true. So if you look on the left-hand side, the green line is dairy prices in real terms. And essentially that hasn't really increased. But what has happened is we've been producing a lot more dairy products. And the reason why we've been able to do that is because we are really, really good at raising lots of cows and getting lots of milk out of cows, right? We milk the hell out of them. So on the left-hand side, you can see, I don't know about the details of how they do it, to be fair. On the left-hand side, you can see how many cows we have per hectare, so we become much more intensive, and it comes with some real costs, right? A lot of the pollution, the nitrogen leaching, a lot of those other things that have gone on is because we become such intensive farmers. And that probably is less good. On the right-hand side is how much milk we're getting per cow, and that's the science and the productivity that goes into the business of doing farming. And our farmers are actually excellent. They're amazing. The amount of milk we get out of each cow is extraordinary by global standards. So there are some real good wins. And if you ask them how they got there, a lot of it's about pasture management, animal husbandry, breeding, really good science that is done on the farms, in the universities and the Crown Research Institutes, and then implemented on the farms. So there are lots of things that we can do in terms of taking the education and the science and the thinking that's out there and implementing in the way that we do things. So quite a lot of the dairy story, some negatives, but also some really good positives in terms of our reliance and connection. But what is it all for? Why do we even talk about dairy? What's the purpose of economic activity? Why do we do these kinds of things? Well, partly, of course, it's for money, right? We want to get paid. As the dairy farmers, we want to have revenue, so with that revenue, we can pay our staff. So in the last year, the dairy sector earned exports of about $15.5 billion, $15.7 billion. That's a lot of money. That was paid out to staff in terms of wages of about $1.7 billion. Farmers took out $1 billion for themselves in terms of their earnings, and most of that money actually gets spread out to all the people who sell stuff to the farmers, right? $8-point-something billion are going out to your local communities in terms of the fertilizer company, the seed company, the tractor leasing company, whatever it might be. There is a huge amount of economic activity that happens, not because a farm does something, but because all of us together create something. So when we talk about why we want economic activity, it's not because we want economic activity, it's because we want to create fulfilling good jobs for lots of people, right? We want people to have a dignity in life. We want people to be able to do those kinds of things. So you can see the leverage there, right? So we have 14,000 farmers, but they employ 25,000 people. There is another 160 odd, is it 16 or 161? I can't read. 161,000 people in suppliers, and then there is another 15,000 people in manufacturing. So you can see how this impact in terms of why we do certain things are so important. Why so reliant on the global economy is because, you know what? We could not consume that much milk in New Zealand, right? This is just not possible. So most of our milk is exported, and we rely on those global consumers to be able to create that prosperity in New Zealand so those people can go on to do those kinds of things. So what it's really about, why we do all this reliance on the world, is because we want more New Zealanders to be better off. Now, it sounds a bit naff, right? But fundamentally, the purpose of economic activity, the purpose of why we have an economy, is so that more people can be better off. And it has to be both of those things, right? It's both on the average, we're better off, but more people are participating on that improvement. If we're not doing both of those things, we're failing. And I'll show you later that we have, in fact, failed to do enough of that. I want to talk a little bit about the political economy. I have no idea how much time I have because there's no timer. I'll just keep going. I started early, so I think I should have extra time. I'll talk about regime change just for a bit. I'm very close to the end. I was reading this article the other day, and it was really exciting because it kind of really captured that sense of discomfort that I was feeling. Looking around, it just felt really frightening because it felt like something wasn't right. And this quote, I think, really summed it up, at least my personal feeling when I was looking at the economic statistics, is that when things feel intolerable, people blame the status quo and demand change. In the 1970s, that more meant deregulating a rigid economy. Today, it might mean re-regulating an unchained one. And to me, what that meant was there feels like there's something that we're not quite happy with, that something's not working, that somewhere in here, it's not quite working. And so we might be experiencing those kinds of pressures that might be leading us to regime change. And I've been using this slide for a number of years, and things come and go from it. But the first time I used it was for a judges conference where I had all the judges in front of me, and I was telling them why the world was changing and why their job was changing. And I want to say the same thing to you, because it's all of us that are dealing with a society that is shifting. And the big shifts that are coming from, at least in my view, is it starts with climate change as one of the big dominant drivers. The floods that we're seeing, the droughts that we're seeing, the fires that we're seeing, the loss of insurance, the retreat of insurance, the retreat of where we can live, all of these things are related to climate change, and they are going to come through to some pretty significant decisions in terms of how we do things. It's all happening sooner than we expected. Oh, I apparently have 15 minutes.
That includes questions.
Oh, tricky eye. I've got my eye on you, buddy.
Just when I cycle up beside you, that's when you know that.
also the way that we think about the world, the way that we think about politics, the way we think about global geopolitics, it was all kind of based on the Washington Consensus, which really emerged after the Second World War and after the Cold War. You know, there was a way of doing things. There was a dominant sort of thinking that neoliberalism is at its core, that democracy in its most unfettered way, capitalism in its most unfettered way would be the good thing. Central banks should just take care of inflation and governments should back off, right? But those things are not happening because what we have seen since the global financial crisis more than 10 years ago, that we're bailing out these scions of capitalism, right? Wall Street got bailed out. If you're so smart, why do you need bailing out? More than once. It's because capitalism cannot run without some kind of backstop. We need rules and regulations because humans are full of foibles. We are greedy. We're short-sighted, and we need boundaries, we need encouragement, we need rules to stop us from doing some of those kinds of things. In the last few years, we've also seen that the world has moved towards much more of a war footing. What's happening in Ukraine, what's happening in the South China Sea, these are all important developments that says we've gone from essentially very much a priority on economic growth, create jobs, create economic prosperity, to one saying, actually, we also need to dominate how much resource we command. We need to dominate how much security we have for ourselves. And this realignment of geopolitics is really important. We are very uncomfortable talking about this stuff, but essentially we're moving from a world where the US had hegemony to now a world that is much more fractured, right? And we know that China is far more powerful, but China's not the only one, right? It's much more about the way that we think about having one central power that coordinates. That is no longer there. And without that one central coordinating power, we are going to have geopolitics that's much more volatile, much more changeable, much more variable. And we cannot rely on one strong power giving us that cover as a country to be able to deal with the world. We're seeing a return of industrial policy. In New Zealand, we are like the cartoon neoliberal economy, right? When we liberalized our economy in the 1980s, we went further than the UK, right? And that's saying something, because if you think about it, if you read any book on neoliberalism, Thatcher is held up as the person who did it the best. But if you actually look at the policies, we went further than even the UK did. But we're seeing in almost every part of the world a return of more interventionist governments, where they're supporting industries, whether it's around green technologies or whatever. We're seeing more interventionist governments. We're seeing more involvement of government. And we're seeing a real rise of misinformation and disinformation, and that means that we are going to have to think really hard about what is true and what is the North Star for our own country. And the reason why all of these things are global is because these influences are global. If you look at what's happening in our politics today, it is not only about domestic things that are infiltrating our political conversations. It is also those global misinformation and disinformation things that are coming to our shores in quite a big way. And I worry a lot, because inevitably those influences are reaching our least educated, most vulnerable groups in New Zealand. And we are going to see that group of people being too big and too hard to deal with. Now, the premise of the last 30 years was that don't worry about all those other things, because there is growth, there is so many people being pulled out of poverty, globalization is a force for good, and everything will be fine. And the reality is that that's not true. The way we know globalization today has peaked and is now coming off. Within our own economy, we know that there are huge fault lines. On the left-hand side is a picture of inequality in New Zealand. And you can see that we really reduced inequality post-Second World War when we built the welfare state in New Zealand. We ripped it open in the 1980s, and then we promised it would get better when the policies bedded themselves in, but they didn't. A generation that was born today is going to be, on average, less well off than its parents. And I think it's a terrible indictment on the failure that we have foisted upon our children, that our children are going to be poorer than us because we chose not to act. When it comes to housing, home ownership rate in New Zealand is the lowest level since the 1950s. When it comes to climate change, you just look at the chart on the right-hand side and it's fucking depressing. When it comes to aging, it's going to be such a big driver, because I think the mantle of growth is shifting. Never again will we have enough young people in a workforce in the future. It doesn't matter how much immigration we have. You can see on the left-hand side, the share of people who are aged between 16 and 64 is going to be falling forevermore. You are the most precious resource this country has. You are the most powerful economic agent this country has. If you are not engaged, if you are not tooled up to deal with this change, then it's not going to happen. We know that there's big differences across our regions. I wrote a book called Growing Apart, and I called Wanganui a zombie town. I'm still not welcomed in. But we know that these gaps between our provinces are absolutely real, and they're going to get bigger. And that is really quite frightening. When we think about the politics and how it's going to change over time, the last time we got to do big change was after the Second World War, when the greatest generation were over 50% of voters. Then it was the 1980s when the boomers were about 50% of the voters. There is nobody that is a dominant central voter in New Zealand anymore. The reason I tell you this is because we are a society that's still looking for the central voter, the median voter. There is no such thing. Our interests look more like a daisy chain. If you're trying to please everybody, it's not going to work. We're going to have to find consensus amongst ourselves because our politicians are incapable of doing it. There are different drivers of change. I think part of it is about we can tinker with existing policies. I think that's a failed course. I think we could introduce new policies that could work, but fundamentally we have to reimagine what we want. Think back to the first picture I showed you of those two mountains. We're imagining the wrong mountain. We're imagining the wrong success. The picture of success is what's wrong. When you don't have the right objectives, the right values in your heart, at your core, you will never, ever get to the right place. If you take nothing else away from this conference and from my talk today, let me give you this thought. Change is inevitable. It can be gradual or it can be rapid. What we do with it is up to us. It is entirely within our control. And when we take our citizenship, our global citizenship seriously, and we plant ourselves at the core of it, only then we'll be able to make change. Thank you.